All right. It looks like we are on. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another camera class. We've got volume, we've got sound. Today is the second Thursday of the month, so that means we have intermediate camera today. Let me pull up the presentation. We got another couple minutes until we get started with things, so I'll give it a little bit of time. I'm going to get it on the jumbo screen here for any students that I have who come in person. But yeah, we'll get started in a little bit, everybody. And as always, if anybody has any questions, they want to chat live, just chat in the chat section on the screen. I will read chats aloud as long as they're appropriate, everybody. Why my screen dongle isn't working? Okay, well, a couple more minutes, everybody. We'll get started. I'm going to go close the door for my camera class, and then we'll get started in a few minutes, everyone. Reposition my camera. Alright, well I think we gave it enough time, everybody, so let's get right into it. My name is Saxon. I'm your camera class teacher. I've been teaching the camera classes here for almost a little over a year now. Hi there, nice to meet you. Well, welcome in again. I saw the little comment just saying hi. Yeah, I've been teaching the camera classes for a little over a year now here at Apt. I sell a lot of cameras here in the store, and I'm pretty knowledgeable when it comes to the cameras. Intermediate camera class, we'll get started with it. Anybody who was here last week kind of knows what happened in our class. If for any reason you missed the last week's class and you didn't get a chance to be there for that one, if you go to the playlists tab on our page right now, you should be able to see all of my older videos that I've already shown and taught here in the on the page. So let's jump right into it. So why would you want to go advanced point and shoot, a DSLR, or a mirrorless camera nowadays? In the last class we talked about graduating from your smartphone. You now leave your phone behind and you want to learn how to use a camera. But the real question now is, why do we want to use something like that, and why do we want to break away from something that's not automatic? You're going to hear that term a lot with cameras if you haven't already. The automatic setting on the camera is going to be the camera's main ability to function and do everything that you want it to do without you having to really do a lot of work. All you have to do when it comes to the automatic setting on the camera is point and shoot it, and it'll do the work for you. It's just your creative eye behind the framing. So what I like to say is the reason we go advanced with our camera is because we're after a better image. There's something that we're not proud of, we're not okay with, we're not comfortable with, and we want to get better. So going into that a little bit more, let's talk about the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. Now a snapshot is a quick shot. It's meant to be fast. Oh, thank you, I appreciate that. And I don't play any games, I'm teaching a camera class, so no games. A snapshot versus a photograph. So with a snapshot, you're taking a quick photo. It's something easy, simple. With a photograph, though, you're putting more work into it. So with this one, we have a snapshot. You can tell that we didn't really kind of pay attention to lines, so it's not a even photo, if you will. We have some shadows, we have coloration that doesn't look proper, and overall, it's just not a satisfying image. This might be a quick picture you send to a buddy of yours or to a friend to say, hey, this is where I'm at, then you take a quick snapshot. But a photograph is a little different. Photograph takes work, it takes time, and it takes effort. It takes taking a moment of your time to sit there and dissect things a little bit better. So both of these images were taken on a camera. The difference between them is the thought process and the settings on the camera. With this one, it was a manual controlled shot. We played with the ISO, we played with the shutter speed, and we also played with the exposure compensation when taking this photo. By doing all of this stuff, we made the blue of the sky look more vibrant. The lights look a little bit better. We have, lights look a little bit better. The coloration looks nice. We have nice shadows. The photo overall looks more interesting than what we were looking at on the other one. So when you look at an example of something that is a quick image, things aren't going to look proper. They aren't going to look more artistic or colorful or detailed. They're going to be a fast image. A photograph is going to be something that takes thought, something that takes process, if you will. It's important to remember that because for a lot of people, they're satisfied with that quick snapshot, and other people, they're trying to master and learn what it means to take a photograph. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today. What do you need to know to graduate from that automatic setting on your camera into something that is more advanced, something more intermediate level? First step, and I mentioned this in the last class, is to make sure you're learning your camera. There's a lot of different camera models out there, and there's a lot of different brands, and you can get wrapped up in a lot of the specs or the detailed orientation of it. But what I might recommend is to look up what your favorite camera creator or your favorite camera enthusiast, your favorite content maker, whoever you admire within the field that you're trying to get into, learn what gear they're using. Maybe they're using the top of the line camera, but if they're using Nikon, maybe Nikon is the way to go. So that way you can start to, number one, build your own arsenal of camera equipment, but number two, shoot in a similar style that your favorite pros are shooting in. So always read your owner's manual, flip through, read reviews, watch things on YouTube about cameras, learn as much as you physically can, because at the end of the day, knowledge is power when it comes to a camera. The next thing we want to talk about too in advanced is going to be editing. No matter what we do when we play with our photos, no matter how much we tweak and we play with our lighting or our ISO or our shutter or our aperture, it's always going to then come down to how we edit these photos. We can make color pop, we can make things more vibrant, we can remove things. Things like Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom are so advanced nowadays, they even have AI technology helping to power the editing software. So definitely worth looking into there too. Next thing we want to talk about is the mode dial. Now the mode dial is your driving brains. It is, in my thought process, your shifter in your car. This is how you switch between park, drive, first gear, second gear, and all the other things that are on the PIMDAS, Prindle. This is the same idea. Now, with this, as we look at it, there's a couple things we're looking at. There might be multitudes of different modes on there, but typically you're going to find 5 modes on every single camera. Automatic, meaning the camera does all the work for you. You just point the thing and shoot it. Program auto, meaning you program certain things to be automatic and other things are left manual control. There's aperture priority, which means you control the aperture of the camera. Shutter priority, which means you control the speed of the shutter on the camera. And then the full manual setting, where you dictate every decision that the camera makes. You are in full control. You're in the driver's seat. Automatic is the easiest way to get into it. Program auto is very simple, but I put shutter and aperture priority above full manual because all you need to do is control one feature on the camera, and the camera then does the rest of the work. So it's a great way to learn how certain things function and how they're meant to perform by themselves before you combine them all together. We're going to look at every one of these separately and then we'll look at them together, but we're looking at what we call the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle covers 3 different aspects of photography: your aperture, your shutter, and your ISO. Your aperture is your iris of the camera, and that should be the first thing that we talk about. So let me flip the screen over. Your aperture is your iris, and the best way to talk about this is depth of field, how much light is being added into the camera, and the camera's ability to block out and blur the background to the foreground. So when we look at it, to start with the background to foreground blur and depth, when we look at something with aperture, we're looking at the number. Now when you're buying lenses and you're getting into it, we'll talk about lenses at the very end of the class. You're looking at sometimes the glass quality, but then what its maximum f-stop is. Its maximum f-stop is going to be your way of knowing your ability to blur the background or to separate the background from the foreground. The lower the number in the world of aperture, the better blur you're going to have, and the more focus on your main subject matter you will get. When we look at the bottom of this little chart, we'll see that the f1.4, the pyramid that is behind our waving stick figure, is not visible, it's blurred out. When we're using something like an f1.4 on the lens, we are getting a maximum blur on the physical camera itself, blurring out our background and focusing in on the foreground. As we start to raise that number up, we're seeing more of our background, we're seeing more of the environment that we're in. So the higher the number we go, the more all around of the image that we're going to get, the more depth of field that we're going to have. The smaller the number goes, the less depth of field that we have, and the more we can start to focus in on singular items, blurring out the surroundings of that area, or of that subject. Some examples that I have: you have the dog nose on the left, you got the squirrel on the right. When we look at the squirrel on the right, you can see that the background is almost completely gone via the color and all the other information that you have there with the tree branch that the squirrel is sitting on. It's a pretty good guess that they're probably sitting in a tree of some sort, But now, how high up in the tree, where exactly the tree is located, what kind of tree this is, we really can't make out that detail because we blurred the background out. As opposed to the image on the left, we can see that we have another dog behind the dog's nose. But how much of that dog we can see is blurry. We can make out that it's a dog, so we know that it's not blurred down to maybe a 1.4 or 2 as our f-stop, but it's blurred out enough that our main focus is the dog's nose. Just like our main focus is the squirrel, but rather than blurring out the trees and the branches to a point where you can still make them out, they blur them out enough where you really only see the blobs of color. We call that effect bokeh. Now you can see the bokeh effect right here as well too, and bokeh is very popular when there's lights. So behind this little Lego minifigure, there's actually a set of Christmas lights, of string lights behind it. And what happens is because you're focusing in on the main subject matter being the Lego figure, the lights in the background are going to blur themselves out, but because they radiate amount of light, and that light is susceptible to the camera's sensor, we're picking this light up as little circular discs all around the image. It's pretty cool. Why do we want to use something like aperture priority? Why does aperture matter when we're shooting? Much like the iris of our eyeball, the aperture is extremely important. When you have your eye, if you go, let's say, outside and you stare at the sun or you stare at a shiny surface, you'll notice that the black iris of your eye gets very tiny. It becomes like a dot. As you then get into darker situations, your iris opens up more and more of the black part of your eye is exposed. The reason this happens is because our eye is becoming more and less susceptible to light. The more light that we're able to pick up as we're moving around, the smaller our iris gets. And the larger our iris is, the less light that we're able to see. In the photo world, while that is true, a big part of that is the ability to then blur the background from the foreground or the foreground from the background. That's what we're getting when we use our aperture. So typically what I like to tell people is that if you're someone who is going through maybe different subject matter, you're going on vacation and you want to take pictures both of the kids looking really nice, but you also want to take pictures of the kids maybe in front of all the famous buildings of your trip. Aperture priority might be a good idea because the camera itself will fluctuate everything else. All you're doing is deciding whether or not to focus in on just your loved ones, your kids, whoever it is that you're taking photos of, or if you're trying to get the grander image. Much like this image that I'm using as the example, we can see the girl who's standing in this rocky cliff area, but then we see the beautifulness of the background as well too, that she's standing in front of. So we wouldn't want to blur the background out because we want to see all of that. But now let's say she was standing just in front of a boring rock, we might want to blur that rock out because we don't care. Our main focus is our subject matter. All of it's different and it all is dependent on what you're trying to accomplish. To review again, the higher the number, the more we can see within the frame. The lower the number, the more we're blurring things out and focusing in on a main subject matter or into a main object. So for example, at f2.8, we have blurred out the background completely. We can make out that there is some greenery, there's some other colors behind it, but all we see is the trunk of this branch. As we move to 6.3, the background becomes more apparent, still blurry. F16 and F32 give away almost everything about the image, and we can see the background clearly with the piece of wood in the foreground. So again, using aperture, we are taking it as an example of depth of field and of light. Depth of field being that as we're changing this number to a lower number, we're slowly starting to blur out the rest of our remaining background, and we're focusing in on a main subject matter by the f2.8. By f32, we're focusing on the entire image as a whole. Now the second part of our exposure triangle is going to be our shutter speed. Shutter speed is important because it is the speed at which the shutters close to capture your image. The faster the shutter speed, the faster the shutter will close, but also the less amount of light that it'll allow into the camera. So an important thing to keep in mind when using shutter speed is that the faster that you set that shutter, the more or the less light the camera is going to take in. This is where playing with the exposure triangle is important, But when playing with shutter priority, we really don't have to worry too much about that. And I'll explain in a little bit. But when we look at this, we can see that we have a stick figure running. That's the symbol that we're looking at here. The higher the number is, the faster that shutter speed is going. So 1 500ths of a second, 1 250ths of a second, 1 125ths of a second is moving faster than a second is. So it's able to close and open its shutters in a way where it's able to get an object in motion. So the stick figure that we have running, when we're taking a picture of it, we can see that at 1 500ths of a second, it's in perfect frame, it's in perfect stillness. As we move down to half a second though, we notice that the object continues to get blurry. So the important thing to remember with shutter speed is that while the longer you keep it open, the more light it will let in. The longer you keep it open, the more blurry your objects can become, especially if they're in motion. So it's important to keep this in mind when we're taking photos. The stiller the object is, or the slower the object is, the slower we should be looking at a shutter speed. The faster the object is, the faster we should be turning the shutter speed up. Within doing that though, if we're not on shutter priority, we need to be looking at all the manual settings and making sure that our light and our ISO is also at an appropriate level to allow light to be entering the camera at the speed at which we're shooting at. Another thing to keep in mind is that for most action photography and most sports photography, we need to be at a speed of 1 1,000th of a second or faster. An object that's in motion and a good motion speed will be going so fast that if we take a picture even with a faster shutter speed, it still might turn out blurry. Rather than turning it up as fast as you can and then needing to change the ISO and do other things with the aperture, going up to 1 1,000th of a second isn't as fast as you think it is comparatively, because a camera can go even faster than that. There are some cameras on the market that can do 1/22,000th of a second. I don't even, it's unbelievable how fast. I couldn't even tell you how fast that would have to be, or mimic it if I will. But yes, freezing action, 1 1,000th or faster. We like using shutter priority because it can help us give a sense of motion. A blurry photo doesn't mean that it's a bad photo, and that's always something to keep in mind. When I look at this photo, I see the wings of the bird flapping, and I see the movement of the bird's wings, and they're not perfectly still. The wings are blurry. But the bird itself is perfectly still, so I can see the orange, the yellow, the greens, the browns, all these beautiful colors within the feathers of the bird. We can see that all very pleasantly and proudly, but the wings themselves have a little bit of motion, have a little bit of blur. Not a bad image, just a different image. Mood gets created with longer exposures. So on the flip side of this, if you have a tripod or a form of stabilization, you can set your camera to keep an open shutter for as long as you want it to be. Now, the bonus of doing this is that by keeping your shutter open for longer periods of time, you are letting in the most amount of light, saturating an image, giving it a bunch of detail, quality, color, sharpness. It's phenomenal. On the flip side of doing that though, you run the risk of getting blur, of getting motion, of getting graininess. While doing all this, if you don't properly stabilize your camera, any little bit of motion will detract from the photo that you're trying to get. So it's important that when we're taking photos and we're doing this, we work on making sure that we have good stability or a good tripod or monopod or stabilizer while taking long exposure photos. You can get beautiful detail out of the photos, but a little bit of wiggle or a little bit of shake and the photo could be ruined. Other examples of the long exposure could be to capture that motion. So in this case, we have a gentleman who's standing in front of a train. The train is whizzing past him, and we can see all of the bright lights and all of the rays of motion on the physical train. However, our gentleman, the train platform, the ceiling, and the bike are all in perfect detail and stillness because this person used a tripod or a bench or something to stabilize. So the main question that we're going to ask now is, why do we want to use shutter priority mode? And I think this image on the bottom is the perfect example. Why? If you're doing anything where there's motion or sports, using automatic on a camera isn't going to cut it. Camera will not be fast enough or smart enough to tell you that it sees the object in motion, so it's going to jack the speed up. By using a shutter priority, we're giving ourselves the power to be able to make sure that our image isn't blurry and that we're controlling it properly given what the subject matter is in front of us. Places to use shutter priority would be sports, would be action photography. It could be a runway show. It could be a video that your friend wants to make or something that your friend wants to do that involves motion. Anything that involves movement, shutter priority should either be used or should at least be considered. Another example of using a shutter speed, this definitely would have used at least 1 1,000th or faster. I might even say 1 2,000ths because of the way that this dirt bike is probably going through the sky and how fast it's traveling as it's moving. You need a fast shutter speed in order to get that image. Otherwise, this one in a lifetime photo, one chance photo that you're getting to take might come out blurry. Now, ISO is the last part of our exposure triangle, and it's probably one of the more important, I would say one of the most important ones. ISO is your camera's dictation for how much light the camera is allowing in. The terms for ISO, I always get a little confused. It's a very long term, but it doesn't mean exactly what you think it would mean. In the camera world, it is the camera's sensitivity towards the light. So when we look at the first corner of the photos, in the top left corner, it's ISO 100. We can see that the image looks dark, it doesn't look very vibrant, it doesn't look colored, it looks as if though it's very dark and shadowy. 200, we start to see more of that sky, the orange starts to come out, we see a little less darkness on the bridge and under the shadow of the bridge itself. As we move to the 400 and the 800, we see the sky's full brightness, but we really now start to see the shore, the sandy beach, more of the water, and then even more reflection underneath that bridge. So the lighter we start to turn the ISO, the more vibrant things can become, but also the more grainy things can become. When we look at an image like this one, ISO also equates to noise. ISO and noise go hand in hand. Your ISO might control your sensitivity for the light for the camera, but that also will then be, if it's too sensitive, rather than be a positive, it'll be negative, and you'll start to get these pixels, or what we call grain. Your image now becomes noisy. So ISO is important, and it's important to make sure that you're setting your ISO appropriately, given where you're at within the environment that you're in for shooting. For example, when ISO was first being developed and cameras used ISO, you would see that ISO was written on the film. Whatever film you bought would have a number on there. It would be Kodak 200 or Fuji 100 or Ilford 400. They would be a number that's associated to its sensitivity towards a light and its actual filament that's on the physical film. So nowadays, within that, in the digital sense, we're able to change the sensitivity of the camera and its ability to take in light. We have to be careful as we do that, though, again, because ISO can equate to noise. Automatic ISO is available on your camera, and I always recommend using it. If anything, I think automatic ISO should be on at all times. There's a lot of situations where I think it's great to use automatic or to be setting your own. But my personal favorite for automatic ISO is when you're shooting between areas that are going in and out of spaces. Let's say you're doing part of your shoot indoors, part of your shoot outdoors. Let's say you're on vacation to Disney World. Best example. While you're on vacation in Disney World, you're going to be going indoors, outdoors, in rides, out of rides, outside rides, indoor rides. And it's important that when you're in between all of these different spaces, that you're using something like automatic ISO, because you're not going to be in the same lighting area at all times. Light will change throughout your vacation, throughout your different areas that you're traveling to. Setting your ISO every time can be time consuming, and if you don't set it right the first time, now you're taking a bunch of sample images until you get the right one. And even then, you're still constantly playing with it and switching it and changing something on the camera. the best thing to do in this situation might be using automatic ISO, letting the camera decide for you what it's going to do based on the light that's available. You can still have control over your aperture priority or your shutter priority, or have control over both, but you don't necessarily have to run ISO the entire time. Reviewing everything now back in order, so we started with our aperture. As we look at our top row there, we have our pigs lined up on a couch. The F-16 with our piggies, we can see the background, we know that they're sitting on the couch, and we can see them in clear focus, and the image still looks pretty light on the couch and on the walls. As we start to move down, the background starts to go away and we lose that background, as well as the image starts to slowly get a little bit darker. And you're going to notice that as we move into the shutter priority, or the shutter review. When we look at 1 1,000th, our hand with the hammer as it swings is in perfect stillness and we can see it. As we start to get slower and slower on the shutter speed, that hammer and that hand start to get more blurry. We start to lose focus of it and we no longer can tell what that is. On top of that, our image gets darker and darker as we go from the beginning to the end. So that's something to keep in mind, that while one of these functions might do one feature or one thing, all of these functions on the camera relate to each other, and it's important when we're using full manual to keep in mind that our aperture and our shutter communicate. They coexist. So we need to make sure that we're changing them appropriately based on whatever we're shooting. If the image looks dark, it might not be the f-stop. It could be the shutter speed. It also could be the f-stop. So we might have to work with that in order to get the best image that we want. Going underneath that, we have ISO. When we look at the ISO 100, we can see the black of the table, we can see the copper of the penny, the color looks proper, and the noise level looks normal. As we start to raise that ISO up, as we get to the 2500 ISO, we notice that the color of the table goes away, the penny looks muted, the picture looks grainy. This is something that you get as ISO goes up. So depending on the environment that you're in, it might not be appropriate to shoot the image with a high ISO. Turning it down or turning the ISO up to fit your environment is appropriate. Also using auto ISO can be appropriate. The other thing that you'll notice within this intermediate camera class that I'm going to talk about is exposure. Now exposure and ISO are two different things. A lot of people think that these two are together or that they're similar, and while they are similar, they are not related to each other at all. The ISO is your camera's sensitivity towards light. It's your camera's ability to take the light that is in the area that it's in and make your image viable to that light. The camera senses light that's in the area, reads that light, and then pushes it back out. So that's how you're reading that image. It's taking that stuff in and showing you, by pushing it out on the screen, what you're looking at via the light that it's reading. The exposure takes it and can make it lighter or darker based on the image that you're seeing, based on your camera's exposure meter. Exposure meter, you can raise it up 1 stop or 2 stops. By doing that, you're going to raise the picture's exposure up, making it look more washed out or lighter. It's a great way to cheat when you have already played with your ISO and already played with your aperture, and you're still not getting the lightness or the darkness that you require for your image. This is the way of kind of getting around that without playing with the integrity of the image. Going the opposite direction, so the -1 or -2, you are now lowering your camera's exposure, making your image more dark, less susceptible to its exposure. What I basically have gone over is the beginning stepstones, and it should be all the stepstones that you really need to understand full manual. From here though, now it's up to you to practice with this. I always recommend starting with automatic because I do think that your camera is smart enough to do everything that you want it to do effectively and powerfully. I will say though that with full manual, you are now doing what every photographer prior to a digital camera has ever had to do, and you are now fully using your camera to its full potential. Everything else in the camera after these things is going to be the extra bits that separate the camera, make Sony Sony, make Nikon a Nikon, make Canon Canon, What the camera does outside of these basic features is up to the camera and up to the brand that you're buying. But with the steps and the settings that you've just learned about now, that is the basis to every single camera you will ever own for the rest of your life. The manual controls on there are as simple as understanding light and understanding your subject. What you're taking pictures of, the distance of where it's at, its relationship between the background and the foreground, and then also the the surrounding area around you, the color, everything that's around you. That will help dictate what the image is and does, and you can achieve all of that by using the full manual controls if you choose. Now, in this part of the class, before I talk about lenses to kind of end everything off, I like to go through some images and talk about what I see on the image. We'll break it down. I will talk about its ISO, its aperture, and its shutter, and why I think that, and then we move on to the next one. So in this case, I have my image of two buildings and a bridge. The bridge looks very detailed. The buildings look very detailed. Everything looks very colorful, even though it's dark. With its darkness as it is, I would imagine that the ISO would be turned up a little bit, but not too high. I probably would put this somewhere between a 200 and a 400 ISO. Given that the sky is dark and it looks like the ISO is turned up to make it a little bit more vibrant and bright, as well too the lights that are in all of the windows look a little oversaturated, and because of that I think the ISO is turned up a little bit. The shutter speed I think would have been kept at probably a normal speed. You don't have to go too fast for this, but probably somewhere around 1/100th of a second or 1/200th of a second I think would be a good speed for this. And as far as the aperture goes, because we have such a wide angle shot and we can see the depth of field pretty well, I probably would assume this would be closer to an f/16, f/18, maybe even an f/22. But given that when you start to look towards the very back of the photo, like those buildings that are hidden in the bridge walkway behind all that, that's where I start to notice a little bit of blur. So I'm probably going to say it's an f/16. Here we have a picture of some cherry blossoms. So starting with ISO, we're outdoors, we have good lighting, there's not a lot of harsh shadows if we're not in a very shady area. So ISO's probably at a 100, 200, doesn't need to be too high for this. On top of that too, we have a little bit of background blur going on, but not a lot. So this image, I probably would say that we were probably looking at an f/4 or an f/6 where our background's blurred, but we can still tell that those are extra branches in a cherry blossom tree. We know what that is. As far as shutter speed goes, this probably would have been taken at a 1/100th of a second or 1/200th of a second. Doesn't have to really be that fast. We're taking pictures of branches. Unless there's a lot of wind, that's the only place where we would get blur. So we don't have to really focus on that too much for this image. The two firemen as they're walking or as they're posing. We see our main fireman in the front. We have another fireman behind him. The fireman behind him is very blurred out, but it's not blurred enough that we can't tell that it's another human and another fireman specifically, given the helmet and the walkie-talkie that you can see the colors of. So I would imagine this is probably a little bit higher than the 6 or a little lower than the 6. Might be more of a 4 or maybe a 2.8, but given that you can see him so well in the background, it's probably not that low. ISO-wise, we have good shadows, good color. open shutter or a exposed or long exposure, and that's why you see the blur behind the bike for a train that was moving, as well as those obnoxiously bright street lights. Aperture-wise, this is a pretty wide open shot. There's not a lot of blur, so I imagine this is going to be an f/22 or an f/16, one of the larger f-stops that you can have. Now, it's important that you understand at the very beginning of the class, I talked about making sure that you learn your camera. Anyone can learn this. Anybody can watch my class. You guys need to go out and take photos. Luckily, we're in the most beautiful time of the year for most parts of the world. It is summer. It is time to go out and enjoy your cameras. Birding is a very fun activity if you're new to using a camera. Take pictures of the beautiful feathering on the birds. Flowers are great. Anything where there's detail and intricacy, and you can really try to use the camera and flex the camera to get some really powerful and beautiful images from what you're seeing around you. So use it, play with it. You know, the camera is a beautiful tool, and again, it's important that you learn it, but it's also important that you get out there and put it to use. My best camera accessories I can always tell you about is practice. Join clubs, workshops, people, they're great. Travel, if you're gonna leave the country, if you're even leaving the city or the state, you better have a camera with you. A phone doesn't count. Everyone has a phone. You need to bring your camera with you. If you own a camera, bring the camera with you. It's worth it. Take more classes, join classes. If there's something that you can do and it doesn't cost anything, you'd be foolish not to. And if it does cost something, if you can budget that and you see use out of that and worth out of it, as long as you attend those classes and you get something out of it, there's never something that you'll be wasting money on. And then just YouTube in general. We're on YouTube right now. It's how I teach these classes. It's how I live stream. But I'm just one person. There are hundreds of people out there who love cameras, love photography. It's their life. It's their livelihood. They want to share their knowledge with you. They want to share their tips. My favorite thing about cameras is that it's not a gate-kept community. It's not something where you need to apprentice or you need to know, or like your dad had to be into cameras for you to get into it. Anybody who likes cameras, anybody who likes taking pictures, we live in a day and age where you can go out and do that. You don't have to be a photographer or be a this or that. Anybody who has two thumbs and can envision whatever it is that they see can take a photo. Even if you don't have thumbs, there's ways to take photos. Other recommended accessories, I always say that the top, I would say 4 are my most important things. I think everybody needs it. You need a bag, gotta have something to store that thing in. You should always have an extra bag and an extra memory card. It's so important. If one SD card doesn't work, if you don't have another one, you don't have any way of saving your photos. And I have so many bad stories of myself where I've gone out for shoots. I didn't charge the one battery all the way, and I only get X amount of photos on the one battery charge, and now I don't have any extra batteries, so I'm just carrying the camera around for nothing. A cleaning kit, you get bugs, you get dust, you get debris, you get water, you get everything thrown at your camera. A little kit where then you can clean everything up goes a long way. So definitely have a cleaning kit of some sort. Straps, if you buy a camera brand new, most every camera you buy nowadays will come with a strap that you can put around your neck. If not, we sell straps, Amazon sells straps. There's a lot of products out there for it. Tripods are great if you need stabilization. A hard drive to store your images is great. Filters, polarizing filters, ND filters are all great. They'll help with the light and reducing the light or controlling the light as it comes through your camera. And then additional lenses, which we're going to talk about next. Date your body and marry your glass. It's a very age-old expression here in the camera world. Your camera body is going to become useless. Eventually it will take its last photo, and there's not much you can do about that. You can get it repaired, you can get it fixed, you can get it cleaned, you can get it worked on, but like a car, like a cell phone, like all technology, it has its time and it has its place, and it will become outdated one day. So it's important that when we're doing any investments on our camera, we look to invest in the glass. We invest in our lenses. because if we can keep our lenses in good condition for a very long time, we're going to get really high quality glass that'll work for cameras for the next X amount of decades. Canon, Nikon, Sony, they're very big on making sure that their lenses are adaptable, even as they come out with new products and even as they upgrade their lineup in the future. So first thing we're going to talk about with lenses is focal length and zoom. Focal length and zoom are the same exact thing. Focal length is written on a lens by a millimeter size. Now that millimeter size is not an actual measurement. It's not an actual size. 55 millimeters is not 55 millimeters written out. 55 millimeters equates to the object diameter, then mixed with the optical zoom, or the digital zoom, I should say, of the physical lens. So those numbers that they're writing on there, they're good for you to understand in the sense of photography, that a 60, a 50, a 75, 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter, they're going to look like this. But that's not actually what they measure out to. So when we look at 70 millimeters and we look at this picture that we're looking at, we get the entire image, the whole scenery, we get the water, the landscape, and the birds or the pelicans that we're taking pictures of. As we go to 105, more of the blue and more of the space is now gone. As we get to 200, now we are definitely closer in on these birds, and at 400, we are right up on the birds. So the higher the number, the more distance, the more zoom we get. So more focal length equates to more zoom. Focal length, though, also equates to compression. So focal length and compression go along. So while, yes, getting more zoom is great, especially if you're trying to get more detailed photos from a distance, but zoom can also screw with our subject matters. When you look at this face, for example, the higher the number goes, the more fat the face becomes, and the smaller the number goes, the more thin the face becomes, versus a pancake face. It's important to remember that. While we look at that compression, though, you can see that our subject matter stays in the same position, but the background and the foreground, or the background specifically, becomes more and more into focus. So another thing to put into perspective too. As you're zooming, things that don't appear as close will now appear more close. If you're taking pictures of people, you will notice that the people might get closer, but so will the background. So it's all something to keep in mind as you're shooting. Common lenses that you're going to see across the board, what's out there and what people are getting the most of. Typically when you buy a camera, you're going to get a kit lens. That's your standard lens that comes in the box. If you're brand new to photography, get this. Get the kit lens. There is no point in buying the most expensive lens that you can get right off the bat before you even know what you're looking at. Some people don't need the best lenses. Some people can get away with getting the entry-level lenses because they do exactly what they need to do. That's something to keep in mind with this whole thing, is that for photography, while more money in the photography world typically means you're going to get a better image, it's only going to be as good as how you use that product. If you buy the most expensive product and use it for its most basic services, you're not going to get anything better out of it that you wouldn't have gotten out of the cheaper lens. So it's important to keep that in mind. I believe that the kit lens will do most everything that you need. Once you become more specialized and you really see that, I want to do XYZ, my kit lens won't let me do XYZ. That's when I feel like now you've realized and you've graduated, and now you know the next lens to get yourself. So start with the kit lens if you're brand new to this. For those who've been in the game for a little bit, for a long time, I would say, or for even a little bit, you're going to hear the term Nifty 50 or prime lens. Nifty 50 is the 50 millimeter, and the 50 millimeter is supposed to be the most true to eye the way our body perceives images. When you look through your two eyes right now and you look at yourself in the mirror, you are seeing yourself in what we consider to be a 50 millimeter view. That is the least amount of distortion to no distortion that you can have on your subject matter and the world around you. Gives you the most true experience to the human eye. 50 millimeter is great. The Nifty 50, it's the pride and joy. Anytime we have a number lens where the number itself does not change or fluctuate, we call it a prime lens. So this 50 millimeter is a great example of a prime lens. Another example is a 20mm lens, a 35mm lens, a 105mm lens, a 200mm lens. Canon even makes an 800mm prime. There are many different lenses out there, and there are a lot of different primes. Everybody has a different need for a prime. The Nifty 50 is the most common and probably the most popular prime lens you'll see. Telephoto lenses are the other one that you'll see a lot of. Now, a telephoto or a zoom lens doesn't have to necessarily be the fact that you can zoom a great distance to see something. A telephoto lens can be as simple as an 18 to 55mm lens. Because it is telephotoing, it technically qualifies as a zoom lens. Now, its amount of zoom is limited to what's on the physical lens, so it's important to keep that in mind. Now, what is the difference between a prime and a zoom lens? Just as said, a zoom lens will fluctuate. It'll move. It'll give you the ability to zoom in on a subject matter. I like to say this with a zoom lens. If you see a bird or something flying in the distance, you can zoom in to get that. With a prime lens, if you see something moving in the distance, you've got to get as close to the subject matter as possible in order to get the shot that you're trying to get. So, prime versus zoom. Prime lenses, you most likely can get the lowest aperture possible on there, which can be a 1.4 or 1.8, depending on the lens brand that you're looking for. With a zoom lens, even if you buy the most top-of-the-line glass, the best you're ever going to get is 2.8. So it's important to keep that in mind too. If you're trying to blur the background out perfectly and you don't want to see a single thing, your main focus is subject matter, you're a portrait photographer, a prime lens is probably most geared for you. If you are a bird photographer and you could give two flies less about blurring out your background, then a zoom lens is probably better for you because of your subject matter and what you're trying to accomplish. So again, depending on the environment you're shooting in and depending on the subject matter, depending on where you're at, will and should dictate the lens you use or purchase. The last lens I talk about before telling you the ones I think you desperately need is the travel lens. Travel lenses are great because they're considered an all-in-one experience. In this case, you have a Nikon. This is a 18 to 200 or 135. The 18 to 135 gives you everything that you need. 18 being your wide angle for landscape and architecture photography. As you move to the 35 to 50, that's your portrait area. I would even say up to 85. 35 to 85 is a pretty great portrait zone. And then everything after 85 is your zoom. That's for the birds. That's for the ones that you see across in the distance that you're trying to move into frame better with. What lenses do you need? And again, I put quotes around need because I think need is a loaded term. Do you need any of these lenses? No. You just need one lens to get the photo done so that way you can take the photo. However you want to be creative, you then can. But what you really need if you're looking to get everything in one go are these three main lenses. They call this the Trinity. A 50mm prime is standard, necessary. It should be the first thing in your arsenal. If you're brand new to this and you want to get the best of the best, 50mm prime, get the lowest aperture you can afford, you will have that lens for the rest of your life. It'll become your favorite lens, I can almost guarantee it. After that, you should have two different telephotos. You should have a 24 to 70, or around there. 18 to 55 is another great example, and then you should have a 70 to 200 plus. You should have three lenses to cover all your aspects. So, you know, your 24 to 70 is your wide angle to portrait. That might be your walking around lens, so you don't have to change lenses. That gives you the ability to go wide angle to portrait and kind of everything in between. That's your walking around travel lens. Or your walking around lens is the way that I like to look at the 24 to 70. Your 70 to 200 is your safari lens. That's your lens that you're using to get distance on your shots. You see something flying in the distance and you want to get the most detailed photo of it as you physically can from the area that you're at. And then your 50 is your prime. That's your portrait lens. That might be your everyday user or the one that you use it when you're trying to get the best headshot that you can or portrait picture. But if you're brand new to photography and you're trying to count your dollars and you're making sure you've got everything that you need, this is the perfect way to get started without breaking the bank and getting 15 or 20 different lenses for your camera setup. you can start with these three, and I guarantee you might not need another lens. This might be exactly what you need. And that's it, everybody. Thanks for sticking with me on that one. I kept it at about an hour and a half, as we always do, at about an hour. I'll leave it open for a little bit longer to ask if anyone needs any questions. I have a couple viewers still on here. Take a sip of my water. Next week, we are going to have the very first ever advanced camera class, so stay tuned for that. We're going to be talking about a lot of photo editing and film content and how to become kind of the next steps in your photos. Now that you've learned manually how to take photos, what do you do after you're done with those photos, and what's the standard? That's what we're going to be talking about in advanced photography or advanced cameras. So stay tuned for that next week. That'll be the third Thursday of the month. And then there are 5 Thursdays for June, so we will be off for 1 week this Thursday, or 1 week this month. Let me look at the schedule right now. So next Thursday, June 15th, I will be here for advanced cameras. June 22nd, we won't have any class because that'll be the 4th Thursday of the month. And then June 29th will be the last Thursday of the month. So we will teach the beyond traditional cameras. But yeah, thanks for staying with me. If anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask. If you don't feel comfortable chatting a question, you don't want me to read it out loud, feel free to email or call me at any time. I'm in the store every day except for Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Yeah, again, thanks for joining, everybody. I appreciate everyone. I'll stay on for a few more minutes, and if anybody has any other questions, feel free to comment. Well, it doesn't look like anybody's got any other questions, and I don't want to keep this guy just open. I'll check some emails. So, everybody have a great Thursday. Have a great night. If anybody has anything else they'd like to ask, mention, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email or call me at the number or email listed. And yeah, everybody, thanks for joining. Have a great night, and keep shooting photos, keep getting out there and taking stuff, and I'll see everybody